She could drive a truck and tractor as a child and grew up milking cows and riding horses. She learned to read by age 4. Her quest for knowledge propelled her toward careers in law, politics, and the judiciary, all of which helped her become the first woman ever seated on the United States Supreme Court. She's Sandra Day O'Connor, an American woman of achievement.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let us march on till victory.
The Constitution of the
is won.
It is the highest court in the United States. It's the court of final appeal. Its rulings are law for the President, Congress, the states, and individual citizens. It is the Supreme Court. And for nearly 200 years, only men sat on the bench, until September 25, 1981. On that day, the look of the United States Supreme Court changed forever. On that day, Sandra Day O'Connor became the first female Supreme Court justice in United States history.
I think it's hard for people today, especially young people today, to realize what a striking political and historical moment it was to pick a woman for the Supreme Court.
At 2:04 p.m., September 25, 1981, with every seat in the public gallery filled, the chamber doors swung open, and Sandra Day O'Connor became the 102nd Supreme Court Justice. From a ranch on the Arizona-New Mexico border, Sandra Day O'Connor had earned a permanent place in American history.
This ranch was in my family for 113 years.
Sandra Day O'Connor was born in El Paso, Texas, the first child of Ada Mae and Henry Day. She grew up here at the Lazy Bee Ranch, the family's cattle farm on the Arizona-New Mexico border. The same pioneer spirit and drive that took O'Connor to the Supreme Court drew her grandfather to this rough, dry, nearly unsettled area of the United States.
There was no houses, there was no wells, there was nothing here. The railroad was just being built through this part of the world. And my grandfather planted the first apple tree in this area and brought in the first Jersey cow, a milk cow, built the first brick house.
Growing up in such an isolated area meant long stretches between visits with friends. Like other family members, Sandra found great pleasure in reading. There was always a scramble for the latest issue of the Saturday Evening Post when it finally arrived at the ranch. Along with reading, Sandra loved to ride, a skill she learned before she could walk. She spent many hours on horseback, learning the ranching trade. By the time she was 8, Sandra could brand cattle, ride a horse, drive a tractor, and shoot a rifle with the best.
We always helped with everything that went on in the ranch, and we always had horses here in the corrals, and we would have to take care of our own horses. And then we always had a milk cow, and we would have to feed the milk cow. During roundup time, which was a month in the spring and also a month in the fall, well, we would ride every day that we weren't in school. Saturdays, Sundays, any holidays.
In addition to riding and chores around the Lazy Bee, there was school. Like her father before her, Sandra went to grade school in a one-room schoolhouse built by her grandfather.
A school teacher lived in my family's house and then walked across the street to teach school, and my dad and his brothers and sisters all attended school through the 8th grade in that school. There was no high school in the county.
The one-room schoolhouse was a fine place to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic. But to match the curious intellect young Sandra Day possessed required a more formal education. Still following in her father's footsteps, Sandra left the ranch and went to live with her grandparents in El Paso. She was 6 years old. My grandmother, she would reflect years later, was a wonderful person, very supportive of me. She would always tell me that I could do anything I wanted to do. Away for the school year, Sandra returned to spend her summers at the Lazy Bee, first by herself, later with Sister Anne and Brother Alan.
We had a radio, but it didn't play part of the time, and of course no television and no phone. And so we made our own fun. Sandra was great at putting on plays and dressing up and doing acting and just bringing the rest of the world into the ranch through those things, and that was always fun.
For Sandra, college meant only one thing: Stanford University. It was the only school where she applied. At the time, there were 5 male students to every 1 female student on the Stanford campus. Outnumbered by the male student population, and younger than most, Sandra confidently forged ahead in her freshman year.
Sandra O'Connor is probably one of the truly bright people you meet in this world.
Sandra had every intention of returning to the Lazy Bee to help run the family ranch or manage a ranch of her own. But a law class in her senior year changed the course of her life. She entered Stanford Law School, graduating a year ahead of schedule and 3rd in her class, just ahead of future colleague Chief Justice William Rehnquist. But even an outstanding academic performance did not guarantee an outstanding job offer.
When she graduated from Stanford Law School, as the top female in her class and 3rd in her class overall, she couldn't find a job with a law firm because there were very, very few lady lawyers and just simply couldn't find a job in a law school. She went to work for a county as a county attorney or an assistant county attorney, and that didn't set her back at all. She just tackled whatever job that was available and did it the best that she knew how, which was in all cases very well, but nevertheless she never seemed discouraged by anything like that.
Sandra accepted a position as a deputy county attorney in San Mateo, California, a job she loved. She did not stay long, however. Shortly after graduation, Sandra married fellow law student John O'Connor. Drafted into the Army, the O'Connors were sent to Germany. For 3 years, Sandra worked as an Army lawyer. Now back in the United States and resettled in Phoenix, Sandra once again had trouble finding work.
Justice O'Connor grew up on a ranch, and she learned how to ride and rope and do all the different things that the ranch hands did. I think that has contributed to the way she approaches problems. She goes after the problem, she keeps her eye on the goal, she assumes that there's going to be a way to get around it, a solution, a good outcome.
The solution this time was to start her own firm with a partner. It was a full schedule for Sandra. In addition to her law career, she was a wife and now a mother.
Even from an early age, was very much aware of how important family is, and she was very, very loyal to her family, her immediate family and even her far-flung family, and is very, to this day, remembers everybody's birthday.
O'Connor always knew she wanted 2 things in life: a family and a career. She once said that living her life without being in the workforce was something that simply never occurred to her. 5 years after leaving her law practice, she returned to work part-time, this time in the Arizona State Attorney's Office, where she became active in the state's Republican Party. So active that when a vacancy opened up in the state legislature, she was asked to fill it. O'Connor adjusted to political life quickly and easily.
From the standpoint of the ability to understand and understand the law, she was by far ahead of everybody. She was exasperating to me. I mean, I understood it. You see, for example, when I would get a phone call from her, I knew that there was something in the bill that was not exactly right. And she would say, now, Burton, on page 3, line 22, It should be is instead of and.
Colleagues found O'Connor to be a middle-of-the-road politician. She opposed gun control and school busing, but helped pass a tough anti-pollution law and on-the-job accident insurance for migrant workers. In the Senate, she went on to become the Senate Majority Leader. But the title that meant most to O'Connor was Mom.
We would be holding meetings, House Senate meetings, and it'd get around 5 o'clock. And Sandra would look up at me and she says, I've got to go. She says, I've got to get dinner. And out she'd walk. And her priorities were that the family was going to be taken care of. And regardless of the politics, she wasn't going to abandon her role as the mother of that family.
And politics were now a big part of her life. The state Republican Party tried to talk her into running for governor. She seriously considered the offer, and in the end, decided against it.
I tried to get her to run for governor. I made an impassioned plea that she would be the first woman governor in Arizona, that I felt that she could win, that she had the ability, and she turned it down. Because I think she felt somewhere in her heart that was not her calling, that her calling was the judiciary.
When she was in the state senate in Arizona, she ran unopposed and got ulcers over running unopposed, and was so worried about, potential failure that it was nerve-wracking for her, and she didn't even have opponents. And so if she went higher than that and had serious opposition, would have been a problem. In political life, in the real sense of politics, probably 60%, the good politicians win 60% of the time and fail 40% of the time. And maybe their ideas are fine, but the time is not fine, or some other thing happens. I personally think Sandra would have a problem failing 40% of the time, because she's just never done that in her life. And she would have a hard time, because however good you are and however persuasive you are as a politician, you're going to have failures.
Instead, O'Connor returned to law, accepting a position as a trial judge in Maricopa County. It was a position she held until 1979, when she was appointed to the State Appeals Court.
I've talked to a lot of lawyers that came before her, and they liked her.
She must have scared the heck out of them, didn't she?
Well, no. Sandra's an attractive lady, personally. But she's got a demeanor that doesn't harbor much monkeying around. I mean, when Sandra is there, it's yes, ma'am.
It was a full, happy life in Phoenix for the O'Connors. 2 thriving legal careers, 3 growing sons, and an active social life. John and Sandra expected to stay in the Southwest forever. And then in 1981, O'Connor's professional life took another unexpected turn.
I'm pleased to announce that upon completion of all the necessary checks by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, I will send to the Senate the nomination of Judge Sandra Day O'Connor of Arizona Court of Appeals for confirmation as an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. She is truly a person for all seasons, possessing those unique qualities of temperament, fairness, intellectual capacity, and devotion to the public good which have characterized the 101 brethren who have preceded her. I commend her to you, and I urge the Senate's swift bipartisan confirmation so that as soon as possible she may take her seat on the court and her place in history.
I will do my best to serve the court and this nation in a manner that will bring credit to the President, to my family, and to all the people of this great nation.
Unfamiliar and clearly uncomfortable with the sudden attention, O'Connor tried to work amid the congratulatory floral arrangements, the phone calls, and the press.
I have to get some time to work today. And I'm hoping things will settle down so that I can do exactly that.
The nomination of a 51-year-old female judge from Arizona took the nation by surprise. To the general public, O'Connor seemed to come from out of nowhere to earn a nomination on the nation's highest court. There was little opposition to O'Connor's nomination.
Justice O'Connor was nominated by President Reagan, who I think had a viewpoint that the Supreme Court was too liberal and wanted to nominate someone who would bring a more conservative tendency to the court.
While women across the country had cause for celebration over O'Connor's nomination, there was cause for concern, too. The issue of the right to an abortion was prompting large vocal demonstrations. Both sides, pro-choice and right to life, were passionate about their position on the issue. O'Connor was viewed by many as an important swing vote. Her opinion could overturn Roe v. Wade, the 1973 case that established the right to an abortion, or uphold it.
Some of the senators wanted her, for example, to commit herself on the subject of abortion and commit herself on various other subjects. And Sandra very politely but very firmly said, "I will judge the cases as they come up."
Politicians and nationally recognized community leaders testified on behalf of O'Connor, urging the Judiciary Committee to approve her nomination.
We believe that Judge O'Connor's appointment is extremely important for the advancement of women and enshrines the principle that there is no such thing as a woman's place. We know that the opponents to Judge Sandra O'Connor say that they are for women's rights and the advancement of women, but we warn that they are not. They have opposed women's rights almost at every significant turn, and we are not surprised by their opposition to Judge O'Connor. In fact, we think that their questioning of her family values on one limited issue shows their own myopic views of the family.
In evaluating Judge O'Connor, we were particularly impressed with her record as a legislator. Her practice on the bench was such that she was not dealing with civil rights and other issues which are usually taken to indicate a judge's position on equal justice matters. And we note that she took a strong leadership position in areas that address the questions of inequities under the law for women, minorities, the disabled, and the poor.
After days of asking and answering questions, the Senate Judiciary Committee voted. Only one member of the 18-member committee voted against O'Connor. A few days later, the full Senate voted. This time, it was unanimous. And on September 25, 1981, the first woman in the Supreme Court's history took her seat on the bench.
Any case that makes its way to the Supreme Court is a case where there are good legal arguments on either side. At that point, the judges have to bring to bear not only their legal skill, but their judgment. And their judgment involves the question of what they view as the appropriate role for government entities and what a good society is, as well as what this word or that word means.
There are plenty of cases to consider. Each year, the court receives about 7,000 appeals. The 9 Supreme Court justices pare that number down to about 100.
The process of deciding what to decide, of choosing those 100 cases out of the 7,000, because as the court does that, it sort of sets the legal agenda for the whole country. And the justices spend a lot of their time, it's not particularly visible time, because they're not in the courtroom as they do this. They're sitting in their own offices, or they're sitting around their own conference table, actually going through those appeals and choosing which are the ones they're going to hear.
In deciding whether or not to take a case, the justices look at a number of questions. Is there a big disagreement in the lower courts about how the issue should be treated? Because if different courts are handling the question differently, it creates confusion, and the Supreme Court is the only court that can give a consistent answer and rule on that question.
Some observers call Justice O'Connor a moderate conservative. Others say the first woman to sit on the Supreme Court bench is impossible to label.
I think generally approaches each case as it comes without much preconceived notion of how it should come out, and so she's been quite influential because her vote really can't be taken for granted by either side.
In the years she has served, O'Connor's rulings have been closely examined to see if the fact that she is a woman has made a difference. Not known as an ardent feminist, O'Connor has often been quoted as saying that without the woman's movement, she would not be on the Supreme Court bench.
I don't think she was known as particularly a supporter, doctrinally a supporter of women's rights. She obviously has never forgotten her own history or where she came from, and I think she's retained a real sensitivity toward women's life stories and the need to be inclusive and the need to make opportunities available.
That sensitivity was demonstrated in a case where Justice O'Connor ruled in favor of a woman denied partnership at a large accounting firm, saying that partner selection at the firm was a process tainted by sexual stereotyping. But in another case, she ruled against a city program that set aside 30% of its contracting dollars for firms owned by women and other minorities. Sometimes unpredictable in her rulings, one thing has never changed about Sandra Day O'Connor: her warm, caring personality. It helps make long hours of work easier in the judge's chambers. Former O'Connor law clerk Barbara Bennett Woodhouse will always remember a call her son Kenneth received on his 11th birthday.
She said, "I want to thank you, Kenneth, for lending me your mother. She is such a help to me, and I know how much you must miss her, but I really appreciate that." And then told him a story about how when she was a child, she'd gone to school in El Paso with her grandmother while her family, her mother and father, were back on the ranch. And she said she knew what it was like to miss your parents. But that kind of thoughtfulness was, well, it made a tremendous difference because the clerks worked incredibly hard. We stayed up late, night after night, and it was easy to do when we knew that the person we were working for was really appreciated what we were doing.
And that kind of thoughtfulness extended to reporters who covered the Supreme Court.
Actually, my baby had been born just after midnight, so I was kind of still asleep. I later heard that Justice O'Connor called the press office at the Supreme Court and said, "Has anybody heard from Linda? Has she had her baby today?" And they didn't even know yet. But I thought that was, and then she sent a very nice note to my daughter, kind of marking the occasion. So I thought that was enormously sweet.
The times and the look of the courtroom have changed drastically since 1873, when the Supreme Court turned down Myra Bradwell's request to be a lawyer. Law, the justices ruled, was too strenuous a profession for a woman. In 1981, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor changed the look of the Supreme Court.
In the same way that I think people believed that having Justice Marshall on the court, who could articulate the pains and tribulations of an African American in this country, brought a different consciousness to the court. I think that having women, Justice O'Connor and Justice Ginsburg, both of whom have experienced sex discrimination in their lives, brings a different sensitivity to the stories of Americans who come before the court.
She came to the United States Supreme Court with an unusual resume, an attorney who had been a politician and a judge. But Sandra Day O'Connor also brought with her lessons and character instilled on a remote Arizona ranch.
Sandra Day O'Connor is the epitome of what ability and talent and grace and brain power will get you if you wait your turn.
Well, everybody in the family is proud of Sandra. You have to be. She has nothing not to be proud of. She has no bad features that anybody's ever determined, and she's very generous and loving and caring and a great person to be around, so everybody is just wonderfully proud of her. And she sets a great example for this family. If we can live up to just a little bit of what she shows us, then we're all better people.
From rancher's daughter to a justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor, an American woman of achievement.